Hello and welcome to a new episode of Podcast in History. Today we'll talk about World War II with Shani Zhang and Olena Nikitiuk.
Hi, I'm Shani. I grew up in the US attending American public schools. We learned in history class that the decision to drop the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the only just way to end the war. After my first year of uni, I went to Hiroshima and visited the Peace Memorial Museum, and there were the charred clothes of children who were in school when the bomb was dropped, the personal stories of mothers and brothers and daughters who tried to take care of their family who were severely injured. The impacts on the city were heartbreaking. This was the most shocking thing to see because this part of World War II, the effects of the atomic bombs, were barely glossed over when I was in school.
Growing up in Ukraine, I remember my grandfather always dressing up on the 9th of May, picking up flowers from lilac trees, taking out his medals and gathering in the center of the city for military parade. Victory Day was one of the biggest national holidays. It was a day off. Veterans visited schools and shared memories. All TV channels broadcasted war movies and memory concerts.
That's interesting that they've called it Victory Day. Doesn't it imply certain things?
We'll further explain the origin and justifications of such terms. In the US, it's Memorial Day on May 31st and Remembrance Day on November 11th for them, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct. In this podcast episode, we will explore this question further. We'll look at different primary and secondary sources that contrast how Japan, Russia, and the US narrate their role in World War II. This is an important topic to explore because generally, countries place a great deal of faith in their history textbook as a way to provide children with an understanding of how history occurred. However, there have also been controversial textbooks, particularly if we zoom out and take history at a global perspective. Take Japan, for instance. Countries that were victims of Japanese imperialism had serious issues with the government-approved history textbooks. These textbooks, such as the New History Textbook, published in 2000, have been criticized to downplay Japanese aggression and war crimes during World War II. Once we realize that there is no neutral or objective way to tell history, the problem of how history is taught to students in primary and secondary schools become more apparent. Even when it comes to technical knowledge, what is included and what is left out can provide a one-dimensional view of how history occurred. That is a particular problem during wartime as countries rely on nationalism and patriotism to survive. In a scholarly article by Michael H. Romanowski, he claimed that any textbook advances a value-laden perspective of reality.
The way Japanese perceive themselves and the US perceive Japanese is different in textbooks. In American textbooks, the Japanese are portrayed as aggressive, militaristic kamikazes. If students take this without question, it could generate prejudice in their interactions with Japanese nationals.
There is a lot left out of American textbooks too, though. There is minimal discussion on the transgressions of human rights on the Americans' part during World War II. As I mentioned earlier, in the Japanese Peace Memorial Museum in Hiroshima, they have exhibits that display relics from the time of the atomic bombing. This was significant in realizing the gravity of President Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In American textbooks, there really is only focus on how the dropping of the atomic bombs was necessary as a way to end the war. In an American Glencoe history textbook, all that is said is, thousands of people died. The devastation led Emperor Hirohito to accept the Allied forces' demand for unconditional surrender. The experience of reading this brief statement is very different from the experience of looking at the artifacts of the burnt clothes of children who were walking home from school when the bomb was dropped, or reading the personal statements of the parents who tried to nurse their kids for the weeks following the attack.
Yes, but if they include first-hand accounts from the family of the victims of the atomic bombing, the US wouldn't look like the good guy who had to end the war anyway, right?
Exactly, but it's such an act of historical silencing for a nation to always try and look like the good guy, isn't it? By doing so, we silence all the victims of the atomic bombing and eliminate the global perspectives of how history occurred. For example, consider the statement immediately released by President Truman after the first bomb was dropped in Hiroshima.
To destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their
He issued a statement that unveiled the top-secret Manhattan Project and justified the American decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. A direct quote is, "I shall give further consideration and make further recommendations to the Congress as to how atomic power can become a powerful and forceful influence towards the maintenance of world peace." He thought the use of the atomic weapon was necessary in order to maintain world peace. It seems like a reasonable perspective until we consider what is showcased in the Japanese Peace Memorial Museum. Such devastation cannot reasonably be the only ultimatum, right?
This is an ongoing historical debate whether the actions of the US in the midst of Second World War was morally justifiable. Some people argue that the US had very little choice at the time, while others argue that it was not a way to end the war at all, rather a way to assert their position at the top of a global hierarchy when it comes to technology and warfare. One historian, Garl Perovitz, explains how the US did not need to resort to atomic bombing, and Truman was advised against it by nearly every civilian and military advisor, and how his final decision was later justified by what amounted to a deception. They claim that the action saved 500,000 to 1 million American soldiers who might otherwise have died in an invasion. Alperovitz uses historical sources to argue that Japan would have inevitably surrendered, and the end of the war wouldn't have come without the added devastation of the atomic bombing. Military commanders like Eisenhower, Arnold, Leahy saw no need to use the bomb. Most of Truman's key cabinet members urged a clarification of the position of Japan's emperor to speed surrender. Truman relied solely on the advice of his incoming Secretary of State, James Burns, who thought the bomb would be an important diplomatic instrument in dealing with the Soviets. This is a topic still debated by historians today, although from the statement released by Truman at the time, it seems he clearly believes that the dropping of the atomic bomb was the only way to ensure the peace and the end of war.
We've already looked at controversies within Japanese textbooks. Can a similar trend be in American ones?
American textbooks were especially tough to evaluate, as most of schools studies history using a different textbook. Another hardship lies in the fact that world history in the US is either taught in 12th or 11th grade, or optional, so students generally have less background knowledge about war.
That'd be hard to evaluate such a huge amount of textbooks. Were there any studies conducted or general trends in US textbooks?
Yes. Richard Lanchman had examined around 102 textbooks published from 1970 to 2009 and concluded that they're mostly focusing on personal experiences of soldiers rather than nationalistic agendas.
It's important to mention that his research lacks a comparative scope, which, for example, Foster's papers presents. In that paper, he looks not only on American textbooks, but examines English, Japanese, Swedish as well to conclude that all of them present nationalistic bias.
Let's also have a quick look at one of the most popular textbooks in the US. It's Glencoe World History. Out of 32 chapters, only one, chapter 26, focuses on World War II. The strength of the textbook definitely lies in its visuals, accessible format, variety of courses, as presented evidence, and clear structure.
What tasks does it ask for the students to perform, and what evidence does it present?
It uses a lot more maps than the Russian and Japanese one does. Uses primary sources like political cartoons, League of Nations treaties, as to determine causes and effects, as well as it has a whole chapter of Holocaust, which the others just generally don't mention. However, the focus of narratives is completely different. It largely looks at wars through the lens and fronts which US participated, like segregation within the American Army or DAT, and ignores one or other fronts or gives just one sentence explanation for them.
Are there any other specific convergences in textbooks which are interpreted in different ways?
Yes, textbooks interpret Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement atomic bomb because of differently, Lend-Lease, the role of the US differently. Besides, if, for example, the Russian textbooks, the main illustration of victory is the hoisting of the red banner over the Reichstag. In American textbooks, it's a photograph of American soldiers after the capture of Iwo Jima in Japan. Military actions against Japan is given much more attention than confronting Germany. It's also not clear from the textbook who took Berlin. Russians simplify the fact that Soviets did it without mentioning the reasons why Stalin wanted to take it before the Americans and the cost of lives that were taken in Berlin while crossing the Oder River.
To conclude, despite a variety of textbooks and critical organizational frameworks used within them, school time allocated for global history in American schools and focus on American actions over the other countries confines students' critical evaluations of World War II. This supports the national view on war that President Truman was trying to introduce via justifying such actions like dropping the atomic bomb. There is a form of silencing of transnational perspectives occurring here. Does Russia also view itself as the only victor of the war?
Yeah, that's an interesting contrast to how World War II is positioned. Let's say for Russian students. In 2013, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, approved the initiative of creating one unified textbook of history for the whole country. He claimed that young people don't understand what country they live in and do not feel the connection with previous generations. In particular, they underestimate the feat of World War II veterans. And also the president called the existing variety of textbooks excessive.
Can't it become a base for creating certain nationalistic myths or excluding silent stories?
I think it can, so let's better look at a standard textbook. It's one of 3 approved ones and was published in 2019. It has 380 pages and 44 chapters, and it has the whole sector there, which was called the Great Patriotic War.
Great Patriotic War, is that the way of commemorating the number of lives that were lost and related to the idea of Motherland?
Yes, exactly.
Is it reflected in the school curriculum or textbook in any way?
So, compared to previously discussed American textbooks, this one focuses a lot on abundance of information and memorization. The reason is that compared to other countries, both Russian and world history is taught in Russia for a couple of school years, which gives more breadth.
What knowledge do the authors evaluate? What questions do they ask and what evidence do they provide?
Authors ask students to give definitions of historical terms, ask to create chronological tables and discuss legacy of figures. Some of them are more creative, such as interview your relatives that lived during the times of World War II. Others are fully aligned with the national view. For example, chapter 27 opens with the question, why did Soviets win World War II? Without mentioning the Allies. There are other questions, such as why is the Soviet Union's front the most important one?
Wow, but as you mentioned, if we look at data, the Soviet lost most of their lives, so one might argue that they're just justifying their narrative and assessing the role of lost lives.
That would be unethical to undervalue it. The problem lies within not nudging students to certain beliefs. There's a difference between asking why did the USSR win and who do you think contributed the most? Why do you think so? How can you support it?
It's interesting that such a shift of focus makes students literally talk in different languages while discussing the same event. I'm wondering what kind of impact it can have on shaping current political discourse and trust.
Yeah, such divergences can positively contribute to US-Russia relations.
That could be probably a predominant view on World War II by the public for many years that was passed from generation to generation and reflected in textbooks as well.
For assessing this, let's contrast how World War II and the effort of Soviet people was positioned in the times of war. Propaganda posters were popularized in most participating countries. There were around 15, the most popularized ones, issued during the Great Patriotic War. The most popular poster was Motherland is Calling. It had to be perceived at a great distance, attract attention, and immediately catch the eye. This was achieved via centering the figure in the front, choosing communist red colors, and behind a militaristic background.
The nature of the chosen figure is especially important.
Exactly. The painter, Irakli Toitzer, had painted many great patriotic war posters. This one was painted out of his wife and figure linked the idea of land and mother to create the image of motherland.
This idea of motherland is still popular among national elites of Russia. Does it have any echoes right now?
Interesting that the image is still highly well known in Russia. It was even coined for the 50th World War II anniversary on local coins by the National Bank. In 1965, the image was also coined on local postmarks and highly distributed. It took only 1 month to distribute the poster.
But we cannot extrapolate such a conclusion just based on one poster. Is there any further evidence?
The image of motherland was coined in other posters as well. You can notice a trend of an image of a mother. The focus on the image of motherland was also highly popularized right after the war. Most monuments, like the Motherland Coast, the Malaya Zemlya Glory Monument, emphasize the figure of a mother, as well as the number of victims that suffered during the war.
To conclude, despite a thorough level of detail, standardization of textbooks, and specifics of Russian school systems, both gives a room for learning more information about World War II and narrows students' global perspectives by viewing the country's actions as saint ones and not exposing information that could damage national character. This continues war period focus on motherland images and number of casualties, which were highly represented by posters and monuments in the war period.
As we've previously assessed, the voices of World War II are echoed in culture, like war movies, monuments, and concerts. Personal narratives, relatives commemorating the day, social, like national holidays, educational, in school programs and textbooks, and political context differently around the world. Hence, it's critical to find points of intersection while presenting such a breaking point in human history.
Each country has its own nationalistic narrative of the events of World War II. This way of telling history preserves national pride and identity by justifying, underplaying, or omitting harmful things the country has to do in order to win the war. What this results in is a lack of global perspective being told. To be truly global, one must take into consideration the experiences and consequences for countries that are not one's own. The perception of one's own country as saints is both inaccurate and harmful in the way it silences the devastation that has been inflicted on another country. It should be normalized to teach history in a way that may be seen as damaging to one's national character. Around the world, history classrooms should be more focused on how students have the soft skills to critically assess biases, historical silences, and one-dimensional historical narratives, particularly now as the world has become increasingly globalized and there are increases in interactions between people of different cultures.
That's such a wonderful conclusion to make. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast and see you in the next one.